Hello, and welcome to People of the Pod, brought to you by American Jewish Committee. Each week, we take you beyond the headlines to help you understand what they all mean for America, Israel, and the Jewish people. I'm your host, Manya Brashear-Pashman. Aviva Klompas has long been a fierce advocate for Israel and is no stranger to the forces that try to delegitimize the Jewish state. After leading birthright trips, she became the speechwriter for Israel's mission at the United Nations, where she was always looking for ways to give voice to Israel's side of the story, amid a cacophony of anti-Israel sentiments. After working for Combined Jewish Philanthropies, she co-founded Boundless Israel, a think tank dedicated to strengthening education about Israel while also keeping an eye on the surge of antisemitism in the United States. Aviva might still write the occasional speech, but on Instagram and X, that's where she's really shaping the conversation and confronting haters. We sat down with Aviva on the sidelines of AJC Global Forum 2024 in Washington, D.C. in early June. Aviva, welcome to People of the Pod's pop-up studio here in Washington.
Absolutely.
Together with Rachel Fish, you co-founded a nonprofit called Boundless. Now, can you tell us the purpose of Boundless and the origins of its name?
The idea is to look at the larger issues that are plaguing the ecosystem in Israel and North America, and to function both as a think tank that does research to understand what's happening under the surface, but then to not just investigate and study for curiosity's sake, but then to turn to action and really to extract recommendations and to pull together partners in order to take meaningful action in order to address some of the larger challenges. So the two areas in which we primarily focus are, one, education. How do we reimagine Israel education in North America for both Jews and for non-Jews? And the area where I spend most of my time has to do with the narrative war, understanding how did we get here, what's happening below the surface, both in traditional and in social media.
You previously served as the director of speechwriting at the Israeli mission to the United Nations. And at that time, did you find yourself not just talking to a traditional institution, but actually trying to persuade or convince, maybe even combat the sentiments of that audience?
Working as a speechwriter for Israel at the United Nations is certainly an experience and an education unto itself. And my former boss, Ambassador Ron Persor, always used to say to us, it's not so much politics and diplomacy as it is theater and a game of chess. And so to some extent, it's about who you can convince in these speeches and in these conversations in the halls and the corridors of the United Nations. But the meaningful action, the real relationship building tends to happen behind the scenes where there's no camera and where there's no public audience. What people tend to see, the speeches that are broadcast statements that make headlines around the world, that's really theater.
And you mentioned when you were on stage with Michael Rappaport at Global Forum yesterday, you mentioned how that job is very limiting compared to your job now and your representation on social media. Can you talk a little bit about why it's important to be on social media and to use that as a platform?
Yeah, so I worked both for the Israeli delegation, so that was working for the Israeli government. I also worked as a policy advisor for the Canadian government. And certainly when you're working for a government, there are limitations on what you can say and what you can do. And one of the great blessings of having co-founded Boundless and working in this nonprofit is that at this moment in time, there's a lot of flexibility and latitude for Rachel and I to really home in on what we think needs to be done and spend our time and our energy there. The great education that I got when I was working at the United Nations was the fact that people would always ask me, well, why is it that Israel participates in the United Nations? This is an institution that is notorious for its bias against Israel. So why does Israel participate? Why would it be a member of an institution that notoriously demonizes, delegitimizes, vilifies, ostracizes it? No country has to be a member of the United Nations. And more than that, in order to be a member in good standing, you have to pay dues. So Israel pays its membership dues to endure the sort of abuse that we see day in and day out at the United Nations. That's the number one question that I get asked, but it was never once a conversation that we had inside of the United Nations, because we never for a moment doubted that Israel has every right to participate in and contribute to global affairs. And that mentality is what I've taken with me throughout my career, that Israel has, and the Jewish people have, every right to participate in and contribute to our communities, our societies, our countries, and bettering this planet.
You also, since October 7th, you have emphasized that it's very important to tell Israel's story, tell the story of October 7th day to day, hour to hour, which is how I view the news cycle of social media. Why? Why is it that it's so important?
It's a part of that mentality that I was describing, which says, I won't for a moment accept that any of this is either normal or acceptable. I'm not going to tolerate a world that speaks to us and treats us as if we had this coming, as if what happened on October 7th was due to us, as if it is normal to be holding over 100 people hostage, as if it is acceptable that Jewish people have to hide their Jewish identity. And I'm not interested in people that will speak with great sympathy about dead Jews, but not take any meaningful or consequential action to safeguard living Jews, which is ultimately what's most important. And at the end of the day, the reason that I'm spending so much time and energy on social media is because I refuse to allow the normalization of what we're seeing day in and day out. And the only way you stop that normalization is two things. Is one, you have to use your voice, you have to stand up, and we also have to use our Yiddish Klompus a bit and try to think about what's happening under the surface, what are the root causes, what are the points of origin for what's taking place, and how can we outthink them? And that's the work we're doing at Boundless.
You have primarily focused your messaging on X or Twitter. You recently, though, moved your post to Instagram as well.
After a lot of people told me that I had to, yeah, a lot.
Well, can you talk a little bit about your social media choices? Like, in other words, is there a particular audience on X that you were trying to reach?
I joined X when I was actually speechwriter for Israel at the UN. And I was very, at the time, we're talking, 10 or 11 years ago, I was opposed to the notion of joining social media. I thought, I don't think everybody needs to know my thoughts. That's ridiculous. And then one of my colleagues at Yisrael Nitzan, a good friend and a diplomat of Israel, he was the one that convinced me. He said, this is very much in line with Elon Musk would say is, it's the town square. This is where conversations are happening. This is where politicians and diplomats and reporters are having conversation. And it's important that you participate. And that is an idea that resonates with me very deeply, is that we need to have a voice in the public square. So that's how I got started on X. And I left my Facebook, and I did have Instagram, but I really left it for a personal private space. And then early on in the war, I had to change the privacy settings because all of a sudden it was being flooded with requests. My Instagram, my personal Instagram, when you open it up, it's thousands and thousands of people that want to follow me. And I'm like, it's my vacation photos and it's family. No, so that's not going to happen. So instead, after a lot of people said to me, there's obviously a whole other audience of much younger people and different people that are on Instagram. Can you just pull your posts over? So I started a second Instagram account, which is just replicating the tweets, and it's at Aviva Klompas.
I'm curious if you have developed relationships, either real or virtual, with other social media influencers. In other words, did you know Michael Rappaport before October 7th, before he became so vocal on social media? And is that in particular, and are others, of new and surprising friendships and partnerships?
So I met Michael Rappaport because I got a DM on X from him that was 3 words, and they were, "Who are you?" And I wrote back, "Who are you?" And that's where we started chatting. And then we had the opportunity to meet in Israel. And he's become a very good friend and a person that I admire enormously. And that's happened in other instances as well, that there's been other influencers that I've met as a result of this that started as online conversations and turned into real world relationships. And ultimately, all of us need to have a community. Social media is a very lonely place, and it's a dystopia. When you pull people in the real world, which is what we do at Boundless, and ask their attitudes and opinions about Israel and anti-Semitism, you get one set of answers. When you look on social media, you get a different set of answers. The world is much bleaker and darker, and that's because the rule on social media is if it enrages, it engages. So the most vitriolic, hateful, disgusting, vile content is the content that will trend, that's most likely to appear in your feed. I always liken social media to the Colosseum in ancient Rome, where you have people battling it out in the center of the arena. And then you have the throngs of crowds cheerily screaming for them, for someone's demise. It is not a venue that is conducive to relationships or conversations or changing minds, if you can sort of visualize that Colosseum analogy. And at the same time, because social media is this kind of dystopia and bleak place, you need to have a community. And that's what I have found with other pro-Israel, pro-Jewish voices, is that it makes you feel like you're not alone in this, that you're not this like single voice that's standing against an enormous tide. So I'm very grateful to the other people that have lent their friendship in this moment.
So I want to pivot a little bit to what you put on social media, mostly the Israel-Hamas war. Why do you think Hamas terrorists are being treated as heroes in so many outlets and venues?
Yeah, what we're really seeing is new tactics and an old strategy. This strategy of how Israel and the Jewish people is being demonized, it's not new. The only new part of it is the advent of social media as a way to spread these lies and disinformation much further. But it really goes back to a Soviet strategy. You had, after World War II, you had the Cold War, and you had the United States pitted against the Soviet Union. And you never want to fight a war on your own territory. So to the extent that you can, you want to fight it on a different front. And that's really what the Middle East became. Israel, as it moved away from its socialist roots and towards its capitalist roots, begins to align itself more with the United States. That poses a threat. The Soviet Union sees Israel in the Middle East as a forward operating base for the United States. And so it begins to align itself more closely with the Arab nations. And in order to fight this battle, it begins a disinformation campaign that has a number of strategies to it that I think will sound very familiar. The first is to claim that there's no connection between the Jewish people and the land of Israel, to paint us as colonizers. The second is to paint us as aggressors and to frame it in such a way as it is the Nakba, not the story of how a number of surrounding Arab armies attacked Israel, not the story of how Israel accepted a two-state partition plan from the United Nations, but rather the story of the Nakba and the demise. And the third is to paint the Palestinians as a people that have no agency, and that all of this is happening to them, and that they are victims in this colonialist, racist world. And then what the Soviets did is they begin to use that type of language that says Zionists are Nazis, and Nazis are the epitome of evil. And so all of the worst racist, colonialist, et cetera, accusations, that's not new. We saw that from the infamous Zionism is racism resolution at the United Nations in the 1970s. So this is a continuation of a very, very old strategy. And as we always see, it starts with the Jews, but it never ends with the Jews.
On the morning that many of us traveled here to Washington for AJC Global Forum, we woke up to the news of the IDF's rescue of 4 hostages. Headlines talked about the 4 hostages being freed, not rescued. And sadly, many more headlines focused on the hundreds of Palestinians who were killed in that rescue effort. I asked why Hamas terrorists are being treated as heroes, and I asked this knowing the IDF has certainly made some tragic errors in this war. But do you get a sense that there is a concerted effort not to treat IDF as heroes?
So first off, I saw them the hostages being spoken about as having been released, as if Hamas just opened the doors and let them go. And the level of condemnation about us going in to rescue our hostages, what did they want us to do? Ask nicely? It's been 8 months. We've tried a series of hostage deals and negotiations, and it's gone nowhere. I don't measure the standard of the IDF's behavior by what the world says. That's going to be a failing strategy for us. I think it's measured by the values of the state of Israel and the Jewish people, and that's why the army has a code of conduct. The people that are more outraged that Israel went to get its people back than the fact that terrorists took them and held them for 8 months, those people need to check their thinking and their values. And that's one of the things that we need to call out all the time. And I think that's a question the mainstream media that's been reporting on it, it's been embarrassing to watch people just essentially regurgitate Hamas press releases How about a little bit of journalistic integrity? How about asking some hard questions like, do we even know the casualty figure? I saw it grow by 100 since yesterday. I don't think anybody actually knows the number of casualty. And then if you had the number, how would you assess how many were actually combatants? If you're counting journalists and doctors that hold hostages in their home as civilians, I don't understand how mainstream media have sort of suspended rational analysis in this war.
Do you also get the impression that the hostages' stories have been downplayed by mainstream media? I mean, these are truly ordinary people, ordinary families who now suffer extraordinary uncertainty, which, I would argue is worse than loss, this uncertainty. Do you feel like that has been lost in mainstream media coverage?
I think that for a while, we saw that the hostage family stories were prominent and they were certainly getting a lot of attention. And now it's a lot harder. Now it's been 8 months and it's a very visual war. No war in the history of the world has had this level of scrutiny, and certainly not this level of playing out real or disinformation on social media. And people are being bombarded with very difficult and very tragic scenes from Gaza. And we haven't really seen that many new images emerging about the hostages because there's so much silence. So in that sense, I can understand why there is a level to which humans can stay interested in a topic without new information. I think that's part of what we're struggling with. And at the same time, we have seen journalists be shockingly callous to the hostage families, and that's absolutely unacceptable.
Can you give an example of what you mean?
Well, we just saw a very prominent reporter from The Hill roll her eyes while speaking to the sister of a hostage when she asked her to believe women.
The New York Times broke a big story, I'm putting big in finger quotes, earlier this week, that Israel's Ministry of Diaspora Affairs organized and paid for an influence campaign last year that targeted U.S. lawmakers, American public with pro-Israel messaging. But the story never mentioned the barrage of propaganda that pro-Palestinian organizations have put out quite effectively. How do you guard against spreading disinformation as a social media influencer yourself?
So I don't agree with what the Israeli government did. I think it was pretty inevitable that was going to become public. And so I think we could have all seen that this was coming, and it was not a wise decision to target American lawmakers. I'm not sure, though, I would call that a disinformation campaign. Disinformation is a deliberate attempt to spread fake information. And I don't think that was the case, but nonetheless not wise. The difference is that my beloved Jewish people believe in truth and integrity, and we believe that if we just tell the same story one more time and maybe tell it a little bit differently, people will finally listen to us. And I think after trying that for a couple thousand years, maybe we should adopt a different approach. And we, again, have to look at what's happening under the surface if we want to do better at social media. You're right, the other side will say anything, do anything, and show whatever image. True, not. They'll say it immediately. 6,000 people were killed in the bombing, an intentional IDF bombing of a hospital. Okay, based on what? It's been 15 minutes. Nobody actually knows what happened. Same thing with the rescue mission. Day by day, the count of quote-unquote civilian casualty grows by 100. We don't know the facts on the ground. We're not relying on third-party verification in the way that we should, and people are just soaking this up. And the other side has realized as much, and they understand that they have the freedom and latitude to say everything. Understanding that, we have to rethink what this picture looks like. In understanding social media, we have to be thinking smarter about the type of information we're putting out and what some of the challenges are. You have algorithmic manipulation, you have bots and inauthentic activity, you have foreign intervention campaigns, you have the echo chambers that exist, we have the algorithms that even when they're not manipulated, as I said, what enrages and engages. We know all of these things, but I don't think we're working hard enough and smart enough to design our campaigns and our messaging in order to address some of them. One of the things that we're doing at Boundless is we started with the very simple question that says, who do we need to be talking to? Any messaging, any communications begins with understanding who's your audience, because you need to tailor your message appropriately. And I'm not sure that we're doing that as much as we should. So at Boundless, we started with that question. We did a major study with a national research firm, and we identified 6 priority audiences. And we ask them their opinion. We want to learn from them. We want to understand, why do you think what you think? Why do you believe what you believe? Where are you getting your news and information? One of the things that we learned is that every minority population in this country believes that they are the victim. They believe that they are one of the most highly targeted people for hate crimes. And the challenge that we have is that when we present them and say, no, we're the most hated group, what we're doing is we're minimizing their experience, and we're catalyzing a sort of victim Olympics. It makes them feel defensive. It makes them feel like they're not being seen and heard. And we're not tailoring our messaging with that understanding. So we need to do a lot more front work in order to understand, who do we want to speak to? What are their values? What are their positions? What's informing how they feel and think about different issues before we start to construct messages? And then we really have to think about the distribution and dissemination techniques that we have, which are right now, they're too uniform. We need to be doing a lot more and a lot differently. And we're hyper-reliant on social media. And social media has a very important role to play, but we all know that if we see the social media as sort of this coliseum, this arena in which people are thrashing it out, you're never going to really have a conversation.
Shortly after October 7th, you wrote, quote, "The state of Israel was supposed to be a living promise that there would always be a place for Jews to be safe from the pogroms and Holocaust that plagued Jewish history. After the October 7th Hamas terror attacks, that promise is broken." Do you still feel that way?
I've been to Israel 7 times in 7 months, and I think a lot about when I first went. The first time I went was 2 weeks after October 7th, and I was in Jerusalem, and it was deserted. And I wanted to go walk to the Western Wall to the Kotel, and I walked through the old city, and it was unbelievable. It was the middle of the week, in the middle of the day, and there was not a person in sight. Everybody was so scared. And I recall friends saying to me, we're having conversations as if it's the 1940s. We're whispering, husbands to wives, about where we would hide our children. Because exactly that sense of security, that sense of comfort had been shattered. The idea was that anybody could jump out, and it didn't matter where you were in Israel. The sense of safety had dissipated. And it wasn't that different here in the United States. And I think to some extent people probably still feel it, whereas in Israel it's been more alleviated. But the notion that anti-Semitism, that you're not safe in your places of worship, in Jewish day schools and community centers, that you have to think twice before you go to a walk for Israel, you have to think twice about whether you're going to wear a kippah or a Magen David, I think really our sense of security has been shattered. And that's one of the great tragedies beyond the enormous tragedy that is October 7th and the living tragedy of the hostages, is the fact that we are all shaken by this, and that it feels scary for a lot of people to be a Jew in the world right now. There's a lot to say about what social media does wrong and how harmful it is and how difficult it is. But I'll say the one thing that means the most to me about being active on social media in the last 8 months is the number of messages I get and people that come up to me in the real world and say to me, I'm scared, and I feel a little bit less scared because you have a voice in the world, you and other people. That people are feeling very alone, that people are saying, I'm in workplaces where I'm the only Jew, or I'm in schools where I'm being targeted, where I feel like I can't speak up in class, where I have to hide my head, when I'm choosing to stay in my room rather than go out. And it's a lonely, lonely feeling right now. And if the only thing that my social media is doing is helping people have a voice and to know that there's others who think this is not normal, this is not acceptable, and we're going to spend every single day raging against it, that will have been worth it.
Aviva, thank you so much for joining us on the sidelines of Global Forum.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening. This episode is brought to you by AJC. Our producer is Atara Lakritz. Our sound engineer is TK Broderick. You can subscribe to People of the Pod on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Google Podcasts, or learn more at ajc.org/peopleofthepod. The views and opinions of our guests don't necessarily reflect the positions of AJC. We'd love to hear your views and opinions or your questions. You can reach us at peopleofthepod@ajc.org. If you've enjoyed this episode, please be sure to tell your friends, tag us on social media with #PeopleOfThePod,
And hop on to Apple Podcasts to rate us and write a review to help more listeners find us. Tune in next week for another episode of People of the Pod.